vacation, so we'll check the fridge and see what we'll find. But before that, let me get ready. I am terribly sorry. When I recorded this video, I had some problems with my phone and it didn't capture the video. And since I only use my phone for voice recording, I also lost the audio. Okay, let's start. So please ignore my lips movement because while cooking, I wasn't aware that it didn't record and kept on commenting the steps. Oopsie. So this is also why the angle might not always be the best one. I hope you can overlook this fact and maybe treat this video more like a podcast. The general idea for this video anyways was to do a voiceover. So here we go. I would like to invite you to cook along with me or to just get comfortable and dive into today's topic. In the background, I will cook some rice with a pan of veggies. I start by measuring a cup of rice that I will then wash 2 times before I add roughly 2 times the volume of water and set the pot to boil. The topic of today's video is Katy Perry's trip to space. The entire internet is already talking about her and the all-women's crew to space, if you can even call it that, and I want to throw my 2 pennies in as well. Why do I say if you can even call it that? First off, they were passenger princesses. The rocket got maneuvered from the ground. Second, the atmosphere of Earth doesn't end at one specific line and rather fades out into the universe, so scientists came up with a low-key arbitrary border, the so-called Karam line, I hope I pronounced that correctly, that is at an altitude of 100 kilometers above sea levels. If you cross that line, you are officially in space with everything that comes with it. For example, the zero gravity. Most takes I have seen so far talk about how this trip is doing nothing for girls and women, or how bad space tourism is for environment, and I agree. I totally agree, and I will talk more about this in a second. Before that, I want to talk about Katy Perry's statement on STEM. You see, this isn't the first time women or an organization claim to be feministic, and this is also not the first time we see millionaires destroy our environment for fun. And as sad as it is, but I don't really expect much of the super rich and would say that it didn't come as a surprise. However, I study math and I have a bachelor's degree in physics, so high profile people talking about this field excites me. And here's a point where Katy Perry could have made a difference, but instead she chose to use astronomy and astrology in the same sentence, as if they have anything to do with one another. I don't know if you have seen Katy Perry's interview for Associated Press, where she mentions this, amongst other things. It's on YouTube and just 3.5 minutes long. In it, she mentions how she wants to learn more about STEM, and while I think this is great, I believe we need more women publicly talking about STEM in a positive way. Sadly, the next thing she mentions is reading about string theory. Now, I happen to have taken a lecture in Introduction to String Theory, and the professor with whom I wrote my bachelor thesis actively studies string theory. I think it's fair to say I had more contact with the topic than the average person. Would I say I know what it is about? Absolutely not. And while it is a nice buzzword, I guess the Big Bang Theory especially made it quite popular, it is still an incredibly complex topic. I only understood enough to pass the exam, and I took the lecture in my 7th semester. The previous 3 years, all I did was study math and physics, and yet that was still not enough to really understand what is happening in string theory. And this was only the first of 2 lectures where we only discussed the easier part. Katy Perry talking about studying string theory by reading a book and then making a joke about how she would fall asleep mumbling Pythagoras, Pythagoras, is just tasteless. I wouldn't claim to learn Chinese when in reality I drew the characters for the letters 1 to 3 and watched a Chinese drama with subtitles. Side note, because jokes are always funny if you explain them, the first 3 numbers in Mandarin are, by the way, just 1 horizontal line for 1, 2 horizontal lines for 2, and 3 horizontal lines for 3. And there's a joke about a man learning these characters one at a day and then never coming back to his teacher to learn the more complex character for four because he thinks he had gotten the hang of it. The way Katy Perry talks about string theory makes it sound like a silly little topic, and while I am against gatekeeping and all for making science and especially math and physics more accessible for the public, I don't think this is the way to go. Also, I don't understand how going to space is related to string theory, especially on the topic of space and the universe. There are so many interesting concepts and things to learn that you really don't need string theory to make it interesting. And because I want to do better, let's start with some facts about our atmosphere before we can understand how a rocket affects climate change, because there's more to it than just a lot of fuel being blasted into the atmosphere. We start on the ground and work our way up. I will mention some heights, and I think it is really interesting to think about the same distance on Earth, because if you put it into perspective, outer space really isn't that far away. First, you need to know that the atmosphere is not one homogeneous blob around Earth. Quite the opposite. Here, where we are, air has its highest density, and the further up you go, the thinner air gets. If you've ever been to a high mountain, you felt that. This is why we will not talk about the atmosphere as a whole and rather distinguish between the different layers. The lowest layer, so the one we, all animals and plants live in, is called the troposphere. Also in the troposphere are all our industries, cars, and weather. Yes, you heard that correctly. Our weather is mainly formed in the lower 8 to 18 kilometers. So if you've run a half marathon, congrats! You have run more kilometers than the height of the first atmospheric layer is high. However, even if it were possible to run upwards, this run would be even nastier than a full marathon. Because when we start at an average temperature of, let's say, 17 degrees Celsius at the surface of Earth, the temperature would drop to an average of minus 51 degrees Celsius in the tropopause. The tropopause is relatively thin and doesn't count as a real layer, but rather a transition layer from the troposphere to the stratosphere above. The stratosphere starts at around 6 to 12 kilometers above the surface and goes up to 50 kilometers above surface. So if you wanted to run this distance, you better prepare for a marathon. However, at least the temperature would increase. Increase. Doesn't temperature decrease with height? Well, yes, in the troposphere, so everything we can experience. The stratosphere, however, works differently. We remember that the tropopause, where we started in, is about 51 degrees Celsius cold. When we reach the top of the stratosphere, it is only minus 15 degrees Celsius cold. The additional 36 degrees are closely linked to ozone. You might have heard of ozone in the context of the ozone hole that we luckily got to close, at least by big chunks. Or when weather forecasters tell you to stay inside or use an extra layer of sunscreen because the ozone layer is thin. Important for later is that this layer holds very little water vapor, with about 99% of all water vapor being in the lowest layer, the weather layer right above our heads. So it is obvious that clouds form in the lowest layer. And in the transition layer, you can only find the tops of these huge, often dark clouds that often bring a thunderstorm. Right above the stratosphere, we find the mesosphere. Here we are between 50 and 80 kilometers above surface, and temperature drops again the higher we get. The top of this layer is the coldest place found within the Earth system, with an average temperature of about minus 85 degrees Celsius. The last layer we are interested in already expands into space and is called thermosphere. Starting at 80 kilometers above surface, this layer then goes a bit overboard and only ends at about 700 kilometers above surface and well above the official border of space. For quick relation, popular orbits of satellites are between 160 and 2,000 kilometers above surface, and the ISS, the International Space Station, orbits Earth at 408 kilometers above surface. Fun fact, in clear nights you can see the ISS with your naked eye. If we want to go even higher, we enter first the exosphere and then at 10,000 kilometers above surface, finally the edge of outer space. Everything that happens here doesn't interest us today. Another comment about the cooking process. I have taken out and heated up the pan and cut the zucchini, mushrooms, and the paprika I remembered I had. First, I heat the mushrooms up in a dry pan until they get a golden color. Once they look good, I put them aside and add oil to the pan to fry the tofu that I brought with me on my last trip to Germany because I've only found plain tofu in Spain, but I love me my smoked tofu. So, what happens if a rocket crosses all of these layers? First up, you don't need to understand rocket science to understand that boosting a rocket off the surface of the Earth needs a lot of power. The minimum velocity an object needs to have to escape from a bigger object is called the escape velocity. And just to give you an impression for how fast one has to be, the Earth's escape velocity is about 11.2 kilometers per second, or 40,270 kilometers per hour. To be this fast, you need a shit ton of energy. And even worse, a rocket doesn't emit its gases only in the first layer like every other human made industry. And since these layers work differently, different gases and vapor will have different effects in each of them. Carbon dioxide is the most famous greenhouse gas and in the lowest layer responsible for heating up our planet. In the second layer, however, it has actually the opposite effects and cools down the stratosphere. Carbon dioxide, or CO2, naturally goes up. However, we already have an increase in CO2 in the second layer from 5 to 12% in the years between 2002 and 2014. This is more than the increase recorded in the lower layers, and still without any millionaires going on a short space trip. If you want to read more about this, you'll find a link in the description. Still, the stratosphere isn't the only layer affected. We detect an increase of CO2 in all higher layers of the atmosphere. But if in the higher layers CO2 has a reverse effect, doesn't that help us? Sadly, it doesn't. Not really. Weather is a complex topic, and the increase of carbon dioxide in higher layers triggers a concentration which makes them less dense. So we could have fewer particles in the air and therefore less friction or resistance for example, space debris. That could then in turn become unstable. And I am no expert on space and space travel, but Musk alone has put hundreds of small satellites up into orbit. And no one really cleans up our orbit, so besides the working satellites, you find a lot of damaged satellites up there. Blasting carbon dioxide into the air may alter our atmosphere structure, and with how interconnected everything is, that is never a good sign. The Times published an article in 2023 where they cite an expert who warns that the change in temperatures can also slow subtropical jet streams, worsening summer monsoons in Africa and India. We are still trying to understand what exactly will happen, as rocket emissions in the stratosphere and their effects are only beginning to be studied. It is likely that the impacts will be more critical than emissions on the ground. And while I understand the arguments for launches of satellites and scientific equipment, I can't see how space tourism has a positive impact on anything other than the bank account of some rich billionaire. Still, let's take a closer look. Pollutants that get released by rocket differ, and I don't know the details for Blue Origin, which is the firm that builds the used rocket, but they may include black carbon, CO2, nitrogen oxides, aluminium, and water vapor. On their website, they write, "We recognize the importance of protecting and restoring our planet and strive to minimize our carbon footprint and promote sustainable practices in all aspects of our operations here on Earth. Elements of our sustainable practices include reusable rockets, reusable energies, clear burning fuel, more specifically, By using liquid oxygen and hydrogen to fuel New Shepard and liquefied natural gas for New Glenn, less fuel is required to produce the same thrust as compared to fuels like rocket propellant 1. Sustainable supply chain and thriving for green day to day. Now, the last point at least sounds like blatant greenwashing. However, the point about clean fuel, where they claim that at least one of the rockets only produces water, seems solid, right? Right? Wrong. Water vapor represents the most impactful trace gas in the atmosphere, approximately doubling the warming due to carbon dioxide alone through chemical reactions and physical effects. This relationship between an increase in water vapor in the atmosphere contributing to warmer temperatures and warmer temperatures causing an increase in water vapor is called a positive feedback loop, and rockets might just fuel this loop. Before I talk about the effects of water vapor in the atmosphere, I want to explain what Susan in the kitchen is doing, because we have reached the step for the vinaigrette. The vinaigrette is the salad sauce I prefer, and I first mix mustard with some vinegar, and once that is a smooth mix, I will add oil in a constant stream so that I have a chance to mix it up with a quill, and finally I will add some salt, pepper, and honey to balance out the sour vinegar. Besides the washed salad, I will add some of the onion and paprika. More water vapor in the lower stratospheric layers decreases local temperatures, which changes the subtropical jets into the direction of the pole. That being said, I want to once again mention that millionaires and billionaires across the globe have a higher impact on the climate than the rest of us. The debate about Taylor Swift's private jet is not that long ago, and other rich people are even worse. And this is just their day to day life. Companies like Blue Origin are taking it a step further. With short trips into space, they just passed the 100-kilometer mark, which is the official definition of space. This emission is just going to explode. So, while an all-female club of the elite participates in leisure activities that fuel climate change in turn affects women more than men. So much more that in the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, the world leaders made specific provisions for the empowerment of women. UN figures, for example, indicate that 80% of people displaced by climate change are women. 80%! According to UNICEF, women and girls are responsible for retrieving water in 80% of households that require water collection. So, when water becomes more scarce, women must travel further to find water, which increases their workload and thereby leaves less time for education or jobs. Women are also more vulnerable to the health impacts of climate change, such as food insecurities. Heat waves, floods, and hurricanes can result in injury or death, and even if you survive, you are still vulnerable to the spread of diseases, as contaminated water and damaged infrastructure can increase the risk of infectious diseases. On top of that, women are also more likely to face gender-based violence and exploitation as they travel further to find resources and times of scarcity. And if that's not enough, gender inequalities grow during times of natural disaster, leaving women more vulnerable to gender-based violence. And we don't have to look at countries from the global south. In Katy Perry's own home country, women are more affected by, for example, hurricanes than men. This has to do with women more often being poorer and having less socioeconomic stability. A lot of low-income households are sadly single mothers, so when they get hit, they are less likely to be back on their feet again or need more time, especially since a lot of them rely on community, and if that gets disrupted by displacement, they lose their safety net. If you want to read more on that, I will leave a link in the video description. And even without the horrendous effects climate change has on women, this trip sadly gives us even more examples of women being affected by sexism. NASA just had to take down information specifically referencing women, and even a story about a fictional woman astronaut got cancelled. The Trump administration changes their plans so often, I don't really keep track of that, But all in all, it only seems to get worse. So, what do we learn? The so-called feminism of the millionaires is far off from the feminism we actually need. I gain nothing from a woman millionaire going to space, and she's making a big show out of it, bringing the daisy as a symbol for her daughter. And I mean, okay, yes, that is kind of cute, I agree, but that is far from feminism. Please don't call it that. That is just show. And I get it, especially Katy Perry. She is an entertainer. This is what she's always done. I also get that she uses these kinds of structures because, as a woman in a male dominated field myself, I can understand that you have to use whatever you have to your advantage, and that she probably took feminism as a shield. If you want that to justify her actions, but in the end, it's just an extremely expensive girl trip that got media coverage because we're talking about millionaires. Here, I want to mention how one of the first astronauts, and we're talking NASA astronauts, very first person to land on the moon, has changed his opinion on, for example, religion, on how important climate justice. Maybe I should have put millionaires dying in space because, quite frankly, I don't really care about your sex. If you're a millionaire, you're a millionaire. You have nothing to do with me. Even if I get a good job, I'll never get to work myself up to owning $1 million. There's so much more she could have done with the money. And if she really cared about feminism, she would donate this money. She would use her platform to talk about other projects on feminism. She would do stuff that actually makes a difference instead of framing her own holidays. I know it's just 10 minutes, but in the end, it's a leisure trip as feminist. That's just as if I were to go on a holiday and say, oh yeah, but I went with only my girlfriend, so it's a feminist trip. Yeah, but we still got wasted, partied, and lay on the beach the entire time. We didn't really actually do something of importance. Sure, we took up space on the beach, so now it's a feminist thing? Sorry, it's not. And even if Katy Perry, instead of sharing cheesy calendar quotes, had provided real substance, like showing that this trip had actually changed her perspective and she was now genuinely advocating for feminist causes and addressing the backlash online, even then, I'd say that making a trip this expensive in both money and in terms of carbon emissions, still wouldn't be justified, but at least it would make her a bit more credible. Back to the kitchen, where the sliced zucchini is already in the pan, and while it fries, together with some garlic and in the end some sugar, I peel the onion. However, I will only use half of it and put the rest into the fridge. The way I see it right now, this was mainly a PR stunt by Blue Origin and its CEO Jeff Bezos, whose fiancée Lauren Sanchez was also on board. And he even opened the capsule himself after landing. Also on board were former NASA rocket science Aisha Bowie, civil rights activist Amanda Nguyen, and film producer Carrie Flynn. But we barely hear anything about them. And it would have been so easy to give these women a platform and a voice. I mean, they were quite literally in the same capsule. But instead, the BBC publishes a quote from one of the Kardashians who didn't even go on the flight, saying something like, whatever you dream of is in your reach, especially in today's day and age. Dream big, wish for the stars, and one day you could maybe be amongst them. Yeah, maybe if you're a Nepo baby, but for the average woman, especially in the US, even much smaller dreams have just become way more out of reach. And don't get me started on the hell trans women and trans people in general have to go through. And again, even if an average person will never be able to afford a trip to space, they could have at least reserved front row spots for women and girls to witness the launch, to be inspired, to stand close to a rocket for once, instead of exploiting these seats for media coverage yet again. Fun fact, one of the earlier all-female space flight was over 60 years ago when Soviet cosmonaut Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman to travel into space on a solo mission aboard the spacecraft Vostok 6. Anyways, BBC also says the space tourism industry is still in its infancy, so every successful launch is significant and demonstrates that these short commercial flights can be carried out safely, meaning that we might hear more and more of such trips in the near future, and all the bad effects on our climate will just intensify. I have stopped following the rocket science news a few years ago, but if I remember it correctly, Blue Origin started out as a space tourism company. So far, they have had some collaborations with NASA, but I think that is just inevitable in the space launch industry because there aren't a lot of players and it is extremely costly. So, working with NASA, who is more or less neutral, doesn't surprise me. However few opponents there are, the biggest player in the US is Musk's SpaceX. NASA's already using some of their rockets, and some of the things they did, I have to admit, are astonishing. However, Musk is just a crazy fascist. Sorry, but ever since the Roman salute, as he wants to call it, he can't convince me otherwise. So, from Jeff's point of view, the mission was a total success. With how fucking expensive these trips have to be, the first flights will all carry millionaires and billionaires. So, of course, he would want famous ones to kick off. And taking not only high profile celebrities, but high profile women who are willing to sacrifice their authenticity and pretend that this trip is a feminist topic is the best PR gag he could come up with. And adding his fiancée gives him an additional personal touch, and he can heroically open the capsule after landing. So, not only are they not doing anything for regular women, a comment from Dr. Kai-Uwe Schrogel, a special advisor for political affairs at the European Space Agency, says, "These flights are significant and exciting, but I think maybe they can also be a source of frustration for space scientists. We see spaceflight as being for science, knowledge, and the interests of humanity. Celebrities do it for amusement, but get a lot more attention than the regular astronauts. And it's not like there are no women astronauts or that those who exist aren't on social media. I follow some of them and they discuss the experiments they do in space, representation, and other topics that go along with the job. And all that I have seen try to encourage young women and girls to go into space. Again, at an event like this one, it would have been super easy to give these real astronauts a platform, but they didn't, and instead only celebrated themselves. So, in the end, this has, in my eyes, been a capitalistic stunt and has nothing to do with feminism. This has just been a performative act for own gains. They didn't even try to hide that this trip is a performance with how much they talked about their styled spacesuits and how they want to make space glamorous again. However, they aren't the first woman to make space fashionable. There are women astronauts from NASA that wear glittering dresses to talks where they prove that you can be traditionally girly and smart. I personally did that on a smaller scale as well. While I was tutoring math to physics students in their second semester, so they are in their first year and still pretty young, I wore more feminine outfits, brighter color, pink, and dresses to subtly show them that even if you study physics, you can still be interested in fashion. And unrelated to this disaster of a holiday, I think making space more interesting to women and girls, taking the technological route just isn't it. This path to space exists already, and the girls who want to follow it already do so. To really get more women into space, I think we need to switch tactics because whether we like it or not, kids pick up on social norms super early, and by the time you come to a group of, let's say, 10 years old, the girls have already learned that technology and science fiction is a boys' topic. And if that is the main path to space and astronomy, you already lost them. However, there is a big field concerning space that is dominated by women. And even if I don't get it, and as someone with a bachelor in physics don't support it, I still have to admit that astrology has a big community. I also don't think that these people are all dumb and even have to admit that it has a nice aesthetic. Last interruption because Susan in the kitchen has prepared the salad and cooked the rice. So she is now ready to fry the tofu, and once that is done, we'll add the zucchini and onions as well to heat it all up together. Before dishing, all that is left to do is to mix the salad. So, even while I believe that horoscopes are bullshit and that a moon calendar might even do harm, I think that used strategically or copying their aesthetic, it could open a new path into astronomy for people that up until now didn't consider it for themselves. This might be a bit far fetched, but if we just keep looking at how the ones already working in the field find their way in, we won't expand the target group. So, if the field is dominated by men and they use their fascinations and motivation to inspire kids, they'll only speak to those who are like them, and this sadly often excludes girls. So, instead of mocking girls' interest in astrology, we should focus on making astronomy more appealing because honestly, space is fucking beautiful and has enough to offer to make astrology look old. And if that seems too extreme, we could try using the wonder a lot of kids experience when looking at the moon to try to boost their imagination and expand it to other planets, and ultimately to astronomy, rocket science, or physics in general. One of my first year professors said that curiosity and imagination are essential parts of a physicist's toolkit. Yet, I rarely see these used to make kids care about STEM. I will stop myself here and will only recommend you to check out Amanda Nyan's Insta and her story because she actually has to say something and has made real change. I think she deserves more attention and was kinda worth the trip. Let me know in the comments what you think. Would you, given the chance, go on a trip to space? And what do you think would make STEM more interesting to you? I'd love to read your answers. Hope to see you again in my kitchen. Until then, have a good time.